In terms of diversifying, I think repealing Bill C-69 is vital. You've long called for that, but in your video this week, you said amend it. Are you softening the language, or is there a reasoning behind that? What's the thinking?
I think it probably should be a repeal and replace, because the reality is that the federal government does have the regulatory oversight over cross-border pipelines and cross-border transmission lines. So you can't just leave a vacuum. You can't just have no regulation, but you need to have smart regulation. There's a whole section that needs to be repealed where they deign to step in and tell us how to approve projects that are 100% within our own borders. That part can be repealed, but they need to revise how they do the regulatory process for how they do cross-border assessments. Because do you remember, like you probably know some of the details on that. Like they were asking, there was a whole conversation about being able to do a gender analysis to make sure that man camps did not have a disproportionate impact on women. And I think there was some sort of intersectionality issue about whether or not it was inclusive enough. And like a pipeline is a technical decision-making process that
there's no gender to a pipeline, unless you're speaking French.
That's true.
In French, everything has a gender.
So that's why it would have to be, but that's why it would have to be revised, because there are some substantial sections that are going to be extremely problematic because they're so subjective. They have to get back to a technical analysis of doing these things and remove the ideology out of them, and then get out of provincial affairs altogether.
So how optimistic are you? You said you're optimistic about Alberta's future, about Canada's future, about Prime Minister Carney working with you. We saw an announcement yesterday that I welcomed on many fronts because he was talking my language. I've said since January 20th, this is not just about tariffs. Get rid of the tariffs tomorrow. We've still got to alter the way our economy runs. Donald Trump is fundamentally altering the global trading system, and we have to adapt. So he was talking about that. He was talking about support for canola. He was pausing but not scrapping the EV mandate. That's a good start. Are you optimistic that he'll move on the issues that you're raising? You've gone from 9 to 3. Any hope?
We need all 9, but there's certain ones that he has to get started on right away. If we're going to get our bitumen pipeline to the Northwest BC coast, you have to have a rewrite of the C-69 policies. You have to get rid of the tanker ban, and you have to get rid of the emissions cap. No point in building a brand new shiny pipeline if you can't encourage your oil producers to fill it, and even if it is filled, you're not allowed to load it on a ship to export it anywhere. Like those are I call it the table stakes. Those are the minimum they have to do to at least allow us to get a bitumen pipeline built, and then we have to do the others as well. I wish he had just made the decision not to get rid of the net zero vehicle mandates, because I can tell you should all go and talk to your local dealership. Because I can tell you, I've talked to one dealership. I don't want to call them out. I just want you to know. But one dealership has said that they're going to stop selling gasoline and diesel vehicles in January. They're only going to carry EV and hybrids. Another dealership is going to.
Why?
That's how their implementation of the policy.
Wow.
Yeah, they're going to stop selling, because remember how it works, right? You have to sell 20% of your vehicles as electric vehicles. So if you can't get the electric vehicle and hybrid inventory, the only way to meet that 20% is to reduce the gas-powered and diesel vehicles that you're selling. So Alberta buys about 200,000 cars. So we're supposed to, out of nowhere, start buying 40,000 hybrid EVs, right? So if we can't do that, if we only buy 5,000 hybrid and EVs, just do the math on that. It means that they're going to have to reduce the amount of gas-powered and diesel vehicles. So don't worry, we're just going back to the old Soviet system where you can just sign up to be able to get your car in 2030 and you'll get your dishwasher in 2031, right? What's that old joke?
But the plumber's coming in the morning, so you better pick up in the afternoon. Old Reagan joke. But look, by not getting rid of the EV mandate completely, he has not helped the auto industry, which I know is none of your concern too much. But he hasn't helped it because it hasn't given them certainty. Your industry needs certainty as well. TC Energy and Enbridge just announced their capital spend for the coming year. Where's it going?
U.S.
Yeah. So without certainty, you're not going to get the proponent coming forward and saying, I will I will back that Northwest pipeline. What do they need to do to give your industry in oil and gas certainty?
Well, I can tell you, I think that our industry will always find a way. They always have, even with the past 10 years of anti-energy policy. Somehow, after all of the other pipeline proposals had fallen and Kinder Morgan's was the last one and they were about to pull out, finally they were motivated to act, bought the pipeline, built it at 5 times the cost the private sector would have. And you know, at least it got built. But that was a failure of process, in my view. If that's the only way to get a pipeline built in this country, we have not learned anything. But what our industry does is they look at existing lines and they say, how can I twin that? How can I loop it? How can I use compression? How can I put new lubricants in there to be able to get more volume? And they keep on doing that. So some of these American projects are actually going to help with Canadian production if we get rid of the emissions cap. I've seen at least 2 million barrels per day of egress proposals that would bring more down to the United States. And so I suppose that would be the path of least resistance, is just working with the Americans.
But that's still selling at a discount.
I would say it's worse than that. It's actually allowing, because what happens is they buy it at low price, gets down all the way to the Gulf Coast, and then some trader packages up and sells it to somebody else for a higher price, and we're not the ones getting the value of that. But it doesn't do anything to help us diversify markets. And this whole exercise we're going through is not to become more dependent on our U.S. neighbor, it's to be able to find new markets. And the only way to do that is you have to be able to build to the BC coast to be able to access those markets.
You had, last time I saw you was here at Stampede, and the next day you had Premier Ford standing next to you. I know that you've had other premiers step forward and say, show Alberta love, which was Premier Ford's message. How important is it for you and your province as you advocate with the federal government to be able to point to those other premiers, like you did at COF, or the polling that's come out recently, and say, look, the country is behind us. You can spend the political capital.
And I think both of those are important. We did some polling, and I wrote a letter to each of my premiers to tell them what the support for pipeline development was in their province. And it's above 70% in every province, with the exception of Quebec, where it's still 58%. So it is still a majority there. So that, I think, is influential, because that then gives the premiers, they can be emboldened to be able to push the envelope on some of these things. And each of them are. I mean, look at Tim Houston in Nova Scotia. He reversed the frack ban, and he's talking about developing natural gas. Look at Newfoundland and Labrador. I mean, they've got a number of different projects that they're proposing. Manitoba launched its first gold mine in 15 years. British Columbia has sort of a golden triangle of 6 or 7 mines that they want to develop. So every single province, even the left-wing ones, are looking at ways that they can develop resources, develop new revenue streams, get new jobs. So I would say that it's been very influential to not only have the people say, we're prepared to do this, but to also have the premiers look at it from their own interests, because those C-69, although we call it the No New Pipelines Bill, is also the No New Mining Bill. And that's part of the reason why Doug's so frustrated. He's got this beautiful opportunity in Ring of Fire, and yet he's got this convoluted process that will never see a mine developed unless they streamline it.
The feds were blocking that for 2 years. So, okay, we've still got a couple minutes left. Good. Wanted to ask you about you mentioned that it's not placed on, the emissions cap is not placed on any other industry. I spoke to a gentleman in Toronto who owns a cement company now, and he was telling me about the impact of the industrial carbon tax. So they still got that. He said a ton of cement creates a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. So your cement is just going to keep getting more expensive due to the industrial carbon tax. But what would that do if you put the emissions cap on all these other industries? We'd have to stop building concrete buildings, wouldn't we?
Completely. Well, they'd have to find a way to abate, and if not, they'd shut in. You'd have to. Like, if you put an arbitrary emissions cap in, which they have here, which says that you've got to be, I think, like 40% abated by 2030 and then 60% abated by 2035. If you can't reach those targets, it's just like what we're talking about with the net zero cars. If you can't build enough net zero cars, then you just have to reduce the amount of gas and diesel power cars that you sell. If you can't produce enough net zero cement, then you have to reduce the amount of CO2 laden cement that you produce. And so that's a spiral downwards. So we're getting very close to them having to realize reality. We're realizing reality here in Alberta, and if you look at Newfoundland and Labrador, look at the jobs numbers that just came out in the last week. Who are the two provinces most impacted? Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador are two oil and gas rich jurisdictions. So we are already experiencing the result of the last 10 years. Every other jurisdiction is not that far behind us. When you look at, if we had gotten Northern Gateway built and Energy East and Keystone XL, we would be producing 2.5 million barrels of oil more per day, which would be generating $55 billion in GDP for our economy, of which the various levels of government get 40%. You can fill your NATO commitment with that money. You can make sure that you've got schools and hospitals and roads for that money. And if you don't have a new source of revenue, you just can't keep on borrowing forever, as we're seeing.
Back in April, you told me that the drop in the price of oil and all the other headwinds was going to result in a $5 billion deficit for your budget. That was your prediction then. It was $7 billion.
It's going to be.
So how much money are?
Well, I'll say last year, because oil and gas prices did help us out, we also got more production to market. We ended up with an $8.3 billion surplus. We were only expecting $300 million. So that's the good news of what happens when you have that volatility. But when it goes down on the other end, we were expecting oil to be 68 this year. It's not hit 68 very many days in the first quarter. And so if it continues on at this rate.
For Western Canadian Select, it's at about what?
It's about $10 to $11. There's a differential, so you can normally price off what is WTI and then reduce it by $10 or $11. So we've been trending around $11 less than WTI. But if it continues at what we've seen in this first quarter, we're actually going to have a $6.5 billion deficit this year. So oil and gas is.
And then the feds lose out as well, right?
Of course they do, because if those companies are not profitable, the feds get their money from the corporate income taxes paid and the personal income taxes from the people who work in the industry, and they charge at much higher rates than we do. That's why we get our dollars from royalties, they get our dollars from corporate and personal income tax revenue. They're roughly equivalent, but they're just cutting themselves off when they cut off Alberta. And the other way of looking at it is everybody does well when Alberta does well. And Alberta has been historically happy to share the wealth. But what makes Albertans resentful is when we hear Eastern Canadian provincial premiers say, we don't want you to develop your resources, but keep sending us the money because we want the equalization. That is part of the frustration that we have.